Okay, welcome. Let me move that camera a little bit. There we go. Welcome to another edition of Dr. Yass Live on YouTube. It is 1:02 Eastern Standard Time, and today we're going to talk about the differences between stretching and strengthening. And I personally feel there is a massive lack of understanding about what is different between stretching and strengthening. And I think people don't know what they're supposed to be used for, how they work, why one is better than another in certain circumstances, what the long term benefits are versus stretching and strengthening. So I thought today would be a good opportunity to try to discuss this and see if some people can get a little more understanding about what stretching means and what strengthening means. So I think that there has been way more interest in the idea of stretching as a mechanism of treating pain or addressing functionality. Certainly, the use of yoga is incorporated in the idea of stretching, that you're holding postures, that you're trying to extend the length of muscle. I think that's a big part of what yoga is, although there's a certain endurance component to yoga. But I think that there's so many more people that have heard about stretching. Certainly, it's a big thing that's discussed. Physical therapy, a lot of what's done is primarily stretching. There's very little stretching, there's very little strengthening involved. I think there are people out there like the Goskew method. There's just a lot of methods out there that promote stretching. So stretching, I think, has gotten a lot more popularity and a lot more publicity than the idea of strengthening. I think the reason is because strengthening takes a hell of a lot of work. There's a lot of effort involved. You're going to have to commit a lot more in terms of achieving proper strengthening. Accuracy is much higher when you're using strengthening. And what's not understood is that there's a much greater long-term benefit to strengthening versus stretching. So let's go on and just try to define the two. What is stretching and what is strengthening? So stretching relates to the lengthening of a muscle by trying to reach a point at which you feel the stretch, the optimal length of the muscle as it is, and you try to slowly but surely progress that distance of the muscle, the range of motion of the joint that the muscle is passing, so that you could extend the muscle. And the idea with stretching is that it is somewhat yoga-esque. It is kind of the idea that this is a very subtle type of thing. I think people end up hurting themselves when they're stretching because they think that it's a more bouncy type of thing. You stretch and then come back and stretch and then come back and stretch and then come back. And they do this kind of movement, whereas stretching is actually supposed to be very subtle. You reach a point at which you feel a stretch. It should be a mild stretch. Stretching should never be very severe. You should never feel a severe stretch. Stretching should be subtle. And the whole idea is that you want to kind of use a breathing technique in which you take a deep breath in through your nose and exhale out through the mouth, trying to extend the stretch during that period of time. And the idea is that stretching should be more short term. Typically, you do stretching for 20 to 30 seconds at a time, and then you want to stop, wait 30 seconds to a minute, and then you want to try to do the stretch again. And stretching can be done typically 2 to 3 times in the bout of the stretch. So you want to do the stretch once, take a rest, stretch again, and possibly one more time. The important thing to understand about stretching is that stretching can be done multiple times a day, every day of the week, as many times as you want, because in stretching, you're really not altering the physiology of the muscle. You're just trying to lengthen the muscle. And so I think it might be important for people to understand what a muscle is, what makes up a muscle, and then understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So muscles are comprised of 2 fibers, actin and myosin. Actin looks like a billion golf balls, and myosin looks like a billion golf clubs. Under an electron microscope, this is exactly what it looks like. So what happens is a muscle contracts by having, this is the golf ball, this is the golf club. The golf club grabs the golf ball and pulls itself to the next golf ball and pulls itself to the next golf ball and pulls itself. So imagine a billion golf clubs grabbing a billion golf balls. They're sliding by one another, called the sliding fiber theory. That is the theory by which muscle creates force. So when we're talking about stretching a muscle, we're talking about trying to have the fibers kind of bypass one another and just trying to elongate them back. Now, typically, we would talk about this, and this is where you really have to understand how to know whether a muscle is shortened or overstretched. So if we talk about the fibers being this type of situation, you could see that the optimal length of the muscle is when my fingers are touching each other optimally. The most amount of my fingers are touching one another. A shortened muscle is one in which the fibers have bypassed one another. If you could see here right now, you see my fingers have passed one another. So how much of my fingers are touching one another? Very little. Therefore, a shortened muscle will limit its amount of force output. That's why shortened muscles are bad, why you would possibly want to stretch a muscle. Conversely, an overstretched muscle looks like this. Again, can you notice that my fingers are not touching one another? If you notice that, you will realize that that means, again, a severely stretched muscle loses its ability to create force. In a case like this, does anyone think it would make sense to try to stretch this muscle further? If you were to stretch this muscle further, you're going to get farther and farther away to where there'll be basically no ability of the muscle to create force, and that makes it susceptible to going into spasm and straining. So we want to try to understand that when we're talking about muscle, we're looking for that muscle to be at its optimal length, where the most amount of muscle is touching one another, creating these cross bridgings, these places where golf clubs can grab golf balls. And then if we have a shortened muscle, that's the muscle we want to stretch. So how would you determine if a muscle is shortened? Well, you have to know the optimal length or range of motion that a muscle should achieve. So for instance, a common one that everyone talks about is the hamstring. So does anybody know what the optimal range of motion for a hamstring should be? If I'm laying on my back and I'm bringing my leg up, how high should I be able to bring my leg up? The answer is 90 degrees. The optimal distance that you should be able to bring your leg up is 90 degrees or perpendicular to the ground. Now, what you would find is that most people actually, where people have been told, and this is where the confusion lies, people are told, oh, most people have have very flexible hamstrings. They're they're shortened. Everyone is told that the cause of their back pain is because they have short hamstrings and they need to stretch them. Well, without anybody actually evaluating that length, the person goes on and says, okay, I'm stretching it because you told me to stretch it. But if most people were to actually check their flexibility, you would actually find that most people are hyper flexible. They don't just come to 90 degrees. They can bring their leg back to 110, 120, 130 degrees. That's hyper flexible. That puts that muscle in this category, not in this category. With that understanding, you would have to realize that if you were to stretch that hyperflexible muscle, you're actually impeding the muscle from returning to its optimal length. So in a case like this, stretching is bad. Stretching defeats the ability of the hamstring to go back to where it wants to be, that optimal length to create optimal force. So this idea that you should just stretch for the sake of stretching doesn't meet the criteria of understanding when a muscle needs to be stretched and when a muscle needs to be strengthened. You have to understand the length of the muscle at the time you want to address it to determine this. And therefore, you have to know what the optimal length or range of motion of the muscle should be and what it actually is. And if it turns out that it's hyperflexible, stretching is not the answer. Stretching is going to actually impede the ability of that muscle to return to its optimal length. Again, knowledge. Knowledge is the most important thing that you need. Not just taking information from some practitioner because they have a particular degree or because you heard that they're famous or whatever. The goal of the YouTube videos and every single thing that I do is about educating people, empowering people. The goal is to give you the tools so you can decide what the right thing to do is. Stop depending on people simply because they have a credential or they've been in the media somewhere. You want to do what's right because it has been proven to be right. And that's what all of the stuff is that I do. It's just about trying to educate. And what I'm providing is physiologically based, kinesiologically based, anatomically based. It's all scientifically based, all ingrained in science. That's all I talk about. So you can trust that when you take the time to listen to what I have to say, it's going to make sense. But please, by all means, think about it. Is it logical? Does it make sense? Never do anything, even from me. I would tell you, don't do something just because I said it. It has to make sense for you to want to do it, for you to trust in doing it. So here we want to understand that stretching should only be used when the muscle calls for stretching. So now let's talk about the quad, for instance, the front thigh. The quad has the ability to bend the knee to 135 degrees, which primarily visually would look like you've taken your ankle, pulled your heel back towards your butt, and your knee is about 2 to 3 inches behind your hip. That's the proper range or flexibility of the quad muscle. Let's say that you have difficulty even trying to get your foot up to bring it in position. That would clearly indicate that the quadricep muscle is extremely tight and shortened. It does not reach its optimal flexibility position. Therefore, the muscle fiber is more like this. This would be a situation where stretching would be beneficial. So we would want to try to stretch the muscle to bring it back to this optimal length. So here's where you would want to understand how to do a quadricep stretch correctly and then perform it. Again, doing it 2 to 3 times, holding it for 20 seconds at about. You could do that 2 to 3 times a day if you want. You could do that multiple times a day. Now, in elongating that quadricep muscle, you're going to bring it back to a more optimal length. And that means that its effect on the muscle's function as well as the bones that it attached to will be made more beneficial. So if you were having pain in your lower back, let's say, due to having a severely tight quad, stretching it will certainly diminish the lower back pain. So it sounds like that's a good thing to do. And in the short term, it is. But you then have to take the next jump of understanding, which is to understand, why is the quadricep muscle shortened? And the answer is, and this goes for any muscle that's shortened, its opposing muscle does not have enough force output to stop the stronger, shorter muscle from achieving that shortened position. So if we're talking about the quadricep muscle being short, we would have to assume that it's shortened for one reason. The hamstring muscle, the posterior thigh muscle that opposes the quadricep muscle, is not strong enough to stop the quadricep from shortening. So if we were to do stretching, and we did it every day and we did it multiple times a day, what would you find the next day when you woke up? You would find that because you did not address the force deficit, the deficit between the weaker hamstring and the stronger quadricep at night, the quadriceps shortened right back up. So you are right back where you were the day before. Even if you had stretched it 20 times, even if you had felt relief during the course of that particular day yesterday, today you're having as much pain and you have the same level of shortening of the muscle. This is why stretching cannot be perceived to be the primary mechanism for resolving muscular deficits leading to pain. Because in most cases, muscular deficits are representative of force deficits, the inability of specific muscles to create particular levels of force to both maintain their force output, maintain their lengths, maintain the positions of the joint surfaces that the muscles attach to. So ultimately, strengthening has to be performed to one degree or another if a muscular cause is determined to be the cause of the pain being experienced. This is the big jump of knowledge and understanding that the Yass method can provide. That is as far as I know, and I'm not aware of any other method discussing the implementation of progressive resistance exercise. Someone just contacted me and said that they're still having shoulder problems, still having referred symptoms down their arm. They have been using the, what's the guy's name? Eskog, or whatever his name is, Eskogich or Agascu, that's it. He's using the Agascu method. And this guy's method talks about doing 20 to 30 postures a day and holding postures, and it's every day, and you do it for 3 to 4 hours a day, and yet you're not getting a result. So I said to the woman, do you acknowledge that? I mean, you're using that, and that's clearly supposed to be addressing muscular causes. Do you acknowledge that you have a muscular deficit causing you? She said, yes, I definitely do think that's the case. So I said, well, what would cause a muscle to elicit pain? And she said, well, it strains, right? I said, right, it strains. What leads to it straining? The answer is there's a certain force requirement for all the activities that you do during the course of the day. And there are groups of muscles that create force cumulatively to allow you to do the activity without straining. So if there's a muscle that's weak and does not have an equivalent force output to the force requirement of your activities, it's going to strain. So what has to change to allow that muscle to be able to perform that activity without straining? You have to increase its force output. How do you increase its force output? By causing the muscle to adapt to greater and greater resistances, thereby causing the muscle to respond by making more muscle mass until there's enough muscle mass to create enough of a force output that's greater than the force requirement of the activities being performed. Therefore, you need progressive resistance exercise, which allows individual isolated muscles to be strengthened. Is that part of the Agascu method? The answer is no. There is none. There is not a single resistance band, dumbbell, piece of equipment, anything, any aspect of strength training involved in this methodology, the Agascu method. Therefore, you are doing nothing. Nothing. It doesn't matter. The scam of the system, as all systems are, is that you're doing something so you feel some sort of relief in the short term, and that makes you think that it's working. But you never quite get to the end point where you no longer have to worry about having the symptom the next day because you never did anything to resolve its cause. You use the Yass method. You use progressive resistance exercise. You are eventually going to get to the point where the force output of your muscles is greater than the force requirement of your activities. And as long as you sustain the exercise, the symptom does not return. That's the difference between stretching and strengthening. That's the piece nobody other than if you come across the Yass method will understand. It doesn't matter if you go for physical therapy. Most people will tell you their physical therapy experience was doing some stretches and maybe some calisthenics. Even if they use resistance, it's a pound, 2 pounds. There's nothing serious being done there. I'm working with an 85-year-old guy who does 13 pounds on each leg on his ankle doing knee extension to get him strong enough to support himself after he hasn't been able to stand for 2 months now, 3 months. And the guy is standing. What a shock. He used strengthening, not stretching, but strengthening to achieve the force outputs necessary to perform his functional activities. So this is the big jump of knowledge and understanding that you need to have. Hopefully you come across this video, you watch it, you'll say, wow, that's why all that stretching hasn't helped me in the long term. Yes, I get a little relief. Everyone talks, yes, I get a little relief. I'm not talking about a little relief. I'm talking about 100% resolution of symptoms and full return of function. That's what you can expect with the Yass method. The key thing that you find out about, just like with so many other methods, is that it's not purposeful. So you go to somebody, they talk about stretching. Stretching what? Stretching for what reason? What if it turns out that, as I presented to you, you actually are able to check and see that the muscle maybe is hyperflexible? It shouldn't be stretched. It needs to be strengthened. Absolute. If the muscle is found to be shortened, stretching it will give you some short-term relief, but it's never going to resolve the long-term cause of the muscle being shortened. These are the things you have to understand. This is what makes the Yass method the Yass method, why it's the only one that's actually achieving any long-term benefit, not just to resolving symptoms, but achieving full functional capacity. It's because it's addressing both the cause of the symptom and the limited functional capability. They're joined. It's muscle. Muscle needs to be strengthened if it's eliciting symptoms and leading to dysfunction. That is what I really wanted to focus on today in this lesson. Understand the difference between what stretching is, elongating of muscles when they need to be lengthened, providing a short-term benefit, versus strengthening, addressing the cause of shortened muscles, which allow them to shorten, which confuses people into thinking stretching is the answer. Strengthening resolves the imbalance of the weaker muscle, getting it to a force output that's equivalent to the shortened muscle, so that prevents the shortened muscle from shortening again, allowing both muscles to achieve optimal force, keeping them at their optimal length, allowing them to have optimal force, achieving optimal positions of the joint surfaces so the joints function optimally. That's what strengthening does. Strengthening can only be done every other day. It should be done 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. There is a progressive resistance component to it, meaning that not any particular resistance is the correct resistance. You want to be working at an exertion level of 8 out of 10 in the exertion scale, which says 10 feels like you're tearing a muscle, 0 feels like you're doing nothing. You should be working at an exertion level of 8 to make sure that you're using enough resistance to cause the change in the muscle to get it to grow. Eventually, your muscle adapts. That exertion level goes down to 5. At that time, you increase the exertion level by shortening the band or moving farther away from its attachment point or getting a thicker band. But ultimately, it's progressive resistance that has to be incorporated. That is at the core of the treatment component of the Yass method. So that is an overview of stretching and strengthening, why you do them, which one is better in the long term. If you have questions, you see this video, you want to talk personally about your issue, you can certainly contact me at my email address, drmitch@mitchellyass.com, drmitch@mitchellyass.com. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I hope you'll like this video because I hope that it's giving you tremendous clarity in understanding what the long-term remedy is for you resolving your pain when you have muscular deficits, and stops you from kind of just wasting your time going on and on and on and just doing stretching and wondering why every day you keep waking up with the same pain after all this effort you've put into this and all the time. and you're just confused, even though these people you're going to are telling you that it should be working. It's theory. Theory counts. Logic counts. That's what the Yass method is based on. So if you like what you're seeing on the page, the channel, Dr. Mitchell Yass, please subscribe. The more you subscribe, the greater the opportunity for Google and YouTube will put this higher in search and give more people an opportunity to find this when they're searching for keywords that may come up based on these videos. If you want to get a session where I work with you, a lot of people are afraid of the coronavirus issue. You don't want to go live. That's fine. For 5, 6, 7 years already, I've been doing Skype and Zoom sessions. You can certainly contact me through my email, again, at drmitchell@mitchellyass.com, and we can schedule a session, and we'll be able to help establish the cause. And if it is muscular, do the exercise, resolve your pain, go on with your life, become fully functional. Just understand that right now I am being a little barraged, so we are looking at probably being out 3 to 4 weeks for the session from the point at which you requested. Sorry about that, but it's the kind of problem that's a good problem in the sense that it just shows I'm helping more and more people. So please do whatever you have to do to get the Yass method. Let's help. Let's work together. Let's spread the word that there is an alternative other than the existing failed system of using diagnostic testing to establish a cause which is baseless, leading to worthless, unnecessary treatments and, unfortunately, chronic pain. So for now, this is Dr. Mitchell Yass wishing you a pain-free, fully functional life. Bye-bye for now.